I'll never forget the night I encountered something that I still can't explain. It was late October, and I was on one of my usual cross-country hauls, driving through Canada in the dead of night, hauling refrigerated goods from Vancouver to Toronto. It was the kind of long haul I'd done 100 times before, but something about this night felt different. And trust me, I've been behind the wheel for years, so I know when something's off. It was around midnight, somewhere near Sudbury on Highway 17. The fog was rolling in thick, swallowing the road ahead. The air had a chill to it, one of those cold, wet nights where you could almost feel the dampness creeping in through your bones. The headlights were barely cutting through the mist, and the silence was almost suffocating. You know that feeling? When it's so quiet, it starts to mess with your head. I was cruising along, the sound of the truck's engine the only thing breaking the silence. I had the radio on low, just trying to keep myself awake and pass the time. But then, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a voice, a clear voice, coming through the static. It wasn't a station I recognized. It wasn't even a normal broadcast. It sounded urgent, almost frantic. "You need to stop. It's not safe out there." I pulled my hand away from the wheel for a second, trying to figure out if I'd just imagined it. I glanced around. Nothing. Just me, the road, and the mist. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself it was just some weird interference. But a few minutes later, I saw it. Up ahead, in the distance, a semi-truck parked right in the middle of the highway. Its hazard lights flashing, no other vehicles around. I slowed down, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Why would anyone leave a truck in the middle of nowhere like that? I pulled over onto the shoulder, my fingers tapping nervously against the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. The truck was just sitting there, but there was no driver in sight. No movement, nothing, just an empty, abandoned rig. I looked around, trying to see if maybe someone had pulled over to help. But all I could see was the mist and a few faint lights in the distance. And then I noticed something else that made my stomach turn. Other vehicles. At least 3 or 4 of them parked off to the side of the road. All just sitting there, hidden in the fog. My mind started racing. What the hell was going on here? Why were all these vehicles just parked with no one around? And where was the driver of that truck? I didn't want to get out of my truck, but I had to. I called 911 right away, my voice a little shaky as I explained what I was seeing. They said they'd send someone out to investigate. I waited for what felt like hours, but when the police finally arrived, they found nothing. The truck's driver was gone, vanished. There were no personal items left behind, no signs of a struggle, not even any footprints leading away from the truck. It was as if the driver had just disappeared. And the other vehicles, they were all empty too. The police couldn't figure it out. No one had seen anything. No one knew who owned those other vehicles. The whole thing didn't make any sense. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stumbled onto something bigger than me. Something strange. For days after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of that abandoned truck sitting there in the fog still haunted me. But the worst part, it didn't end there. A few weeks later, I was driving the same stretch of Highway 17. It was a clear night, nothing like the foggy night before. But as I drove through, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, on the side of the road, was another truck, parked, the engine idling. The lights were off, but I could hear the faint hum of the engine in the distance. I slowed down, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Something inside me told me that if I stopped again, I might never leave. So I pressed the gas pedal and I kept driving. I didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But every time I'm out there driving through the fog, I can't help but wonder if that truck and the others are still waiting somewhere out there on the highway, just watching. of those nights when everything felt off from the start. The rain was relentless, pouring down in heavy sheets, the kind of storm that made it hard to see anything more than a few feet ahead. I was on a long haul, heading south on Highway 65, somewhere deep in rural Missouri. The road stretched out in front of me, slick and dark, with nothing but my truck's headlights cutting through the storm. I've been driving for years, so a rainy night isn't anything new, but there was something about tonight that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't shake it. Then I noticed the car behind me. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle on the road, but the longer it followed me, the more uneasy I became. The car stayed too close, its headlights glowing in my rearview mirror, cutting through the rain like a laser. Every time I glanced back, it was still there, a little too close for comfort. I tried changing lanes, thinking maybe I'd give the driver a chance to pass, but no matter what I did, the car stayed on my tail. After a while, I realized it wasn't just one car. Another vehicle had pulled up behind the first, and they were driving in perfect sync, almost like they were working together. By the time I hit the next truck stop, I was on edge. It was quiet there. No other trucks, no cars. Just the howling wind and the steady beat of the rain against the asphalt. I pulled into a spot toward the back, away from the building, hoping to get a break. I stepped out of my truck, feeling the cold sting of the rain, and headed toward the entrance. That's when I looked back. The first car was parked right next to my truck. Its headlights were still on, and I could make out 3 figures moving around it. 3 men. I froze, my stomach dropping. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized something wasn't right. The men weren't just walking around the car, they were heading toward my truck. I quickly jogged back to the cab, my boots splashing through the puddles, and I slammed the door shut just as one of them reached the driver's side. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors and tried to make myself invisible. The men didn't seem to notice, or maybe they didn't care. 2 of them were circling the truck while the third stood by the rear watching the parking lot. I tried to stay as still as possible, keeping out of sight. But then the 2 men began trying to open the doors. They worked in silence, their movements slow and deliberate. I could hear them whispering to each other, low, urgent voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The rain had picked up again, pouring down in sheets, but I could still hear the crunch of their boots against the wet pavement. One of them stopped by the passenger side, trying to pry open the door, while the other moved to the back of the truck. That's when I heard the sound that nearly made me jump out of my skin. The third man, the one standing by the rear, had stepped out of the car. He was now walking around to the other side of the truck, his footsteps slapping against the pavement as he came closer. I was trapped. My rig was locked, but they could still try to force their way in. They had to know I was inside, but I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't know what they wanted, but I wasn't about to give them a reason to break in. I stayed in the shadows, barely breathing, hoping they'd give up. And then, just as suddenly as they'd arrived, the men stopped. One of them gave a sharp gesture toward the others, and they all backed away from the truck. They weren't done, though. They moved quickly to the car, and I watched as they jumped inside, the engine roaring to life. The car sped off into the storm, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't know what to think. What had they wanted? And why had they disappeared without a trace? I waited in the truck for what felt like an hour, not daring to move. My nerves were shot, my body tense, but eventually I forced myself to call the police. When they arrived, there was nothing. No tire tracks, no signs of a struggle, and no one who had seen anything. The truck stop cameras, they were down. Of course. The police took my statement, told me to stay alert, but I could tell they didn't really believe what had happened. They said they'd look into it, but nothing ever came of it, no reports, no leads. Just 3 men who vanished into the storm. I didn't stick around long after that. I knew I had to keep moving, But even now, whenever I'm on the road, especially late at night in bad weather, I can't help but glance in my mirrors just to make sure no one's following me. Because I know now that there are things out there, people who aren't always what they seem, and I can't shake the feeling that the next time I pull into a truck stop, those same men might be waiting for me. This is something I've been hesitant to share for a long time, but I've decided it's time to get it off my chest. I'm a trucker, and I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing like what happened to me that night. I can still remember it, as if it happened yesterday, even though it's been almost a year now. I'd been on the road for nearly 20 hours straight, pushing through some tough weather, barely making any stops. It was one of those nights when the rain doesn't just fall but comes down in sheets thick enough to blur the lines of the highway. The windshield wipers on my rig couldn't keep up, and I had to squint through the haze to see anything ahead of me. By the time I got close to my final delivery point, I was exhausted, tired in that deep, bone-weary kind of way. I was driving on an isolated stretch of Interstate 80 in Wyoming, just past Cheyenne, where the road gets lonely. This part of the highway doesn't have much, just stretches of barren land and the occasional rest stop. It was around 11:30 p.m., the kind of hour when everything around you is empty and even the radio feels too loud. I decided to pull into a rest area I hadn't stopped at before, figuring it would be a safe place to catch a quick break before finishing my trip. The rest stop was quiet, almost eerily so. I pulled my rig into one of the parking spots and turned off the engine. As I stepped out into the damp, cool air, the wind whipped through my jacket and the rain splashed against the concrete. The place was deserted. No other trucks or cars were parked anywhere, and there wasn't a single person in sight. The only sound was the rhythmic patter of rain on the ground. I didn't think much of it, though. I'd spent enough time on the road to know that some rest stops are just like that. Even in the middle of the night, some places get more traffic than others. This one, I guess, was just empty. I walked towards the small convenience store that was attached to the rest area, hoping to grab a snack or maybe a coffee. The door was unlocked, and when I stepped inside, the bell over the door jingled. The store was well lit, but the fluorescent lighting gave it a cold, sterile feel. The shelves were stocked with chips, soda, and candy. It looked like a typical truck stop, just without the usual crowd. I was at the counter grabbing a bottle of water when the door opened behind me. A man walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. He had a scruffy beard and eyes that, even though it was dark outside, still looked strangely bright. His presence sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing that screamed danger, but something about him felt off. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was just tired. But then the man spoke. "Late night for you too," he said, his voice low and raspy. It wasn't a greeting, more like a statement. I nodded, trying to be polite. "Yeah, just stopping for a break. Long drive tonight." He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with those bright, unsettling eyes. I noticed then that he wasn't carrying anything. No bags, no snacks, no coffee. He just stood there, staring at the shelves, not really looking for anything in particular. I grabbed my water and walked toward the door, figuring it was time to get back to the truck. But as I was leaving, the man suddenly spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "I wouldn't stay out there too long." I froze. I turned back to look at him, but he was just standing there, his eyes still locked on me. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he just gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then he turned toward the door, opened it, and stepped outside without another word. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to make of the exchange. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I'd met plenty of weird people on the road, but that encounter left me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I decided not to take any chances. I walked quickly back to my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The rain was coming down harder now, and the windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. I pulled out of the rest area, turning left back onto the highway, but as I drove, something felt wrong. It was hard to put into words, just an overwhelming sense of being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. The man. He was standing at the edge of the rest stop, watching me leave. I don't know how he got there so fast. I hadn't seen him when I left the store, and the parking lot was empty when I pulled out. But there he was, standing in the rain, staring at me. I didn't stop to think. My foot hit the gas and I floored it down the highway, not looking back. I kept driving for miles, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles were white. The whole time, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the man's face staring back at me from the shadows.